Chapter 13. Arya had not cooled down after a fortnight. Though he went to the temple every day to see her, she was never in their customary meeting place in the vestibule, and when he appealed to Aluti for help, the guard just shook his head sadly and shrugged. Just before their disastrous breakup, Amon had been planning a really spectacular caravan with Arya's help. They were to take dozens of trade items they hadn't tried before, and it had been weeks in the planning. Since they had so much riding on this caravan, he thought that perhaps she would relent and see him before he finalized his trip to Eridu. So, after giving her a week to cool off, he resumed going to the temple every day during the week leading up to the big caravan, including on the very morning his caravan was to leave. It was while he was on his way that he saw something he had not seen in Uruk before. A stately procession of priests and soldiers had blocked off one of the main roads to the temple. As Amon stood back and watched, he thought he caught sight of a familiar face. He hurried down a series of back alleys to bypass the crush of onlookers and got in front of the procession so he could get a good look at the man in the palanquin carried by a dozen slaves. The man turned his face just as he passed, so that Amon could see him clearly. It was Liputenki. Amon found the strength fleeing from his limbs. He was still trembling as the procession disappeared around the corner, and he had to lean against the wall of a nearby shop to hold himself up. The High Priest of Enki was in Uruk. What could have brought him here? Then he remembered. He wasn't the High Priest of Enki any longer. He was the King of Eridu. How far away was the new year now? Less than a month? Was the false king on his way to pledge his fealty to the Emperor in a card? Amon ran all the way back home to see if he could catch Balashi before he went to his lord's manor, but Balashi had already left for the day. Amon felt a strong need to speak to someone, but there was no point in going to the temple, so instead he went to Namhu's warehouse. Namhu was in his office, making the final preparations for their departure, but he didn't know anything about the contingent from Eridu. Amon decided to hang around the warehouse and aid in preparations until they left. He told himself that, once they were on the road to Eridu, these strange, jittery feelings that had attacked him at the temple would leave him, but even the routine of another caravan trip to Eridu could do nothing to calm his nerves. He was agitated and had trouble sleeping that night, so that when they finally arrived in Eridu, his first stop was a tavern to see if he could relax a bit and settle down. The tavern was nearly empty at this time of day, but Amon noticed a couple of men sitting in a corner, throwing back their drinks with a determination that suggested they were doing their best to drown their sorrows in a sea of alcohol. When Amon sat down at a table not far away, he noticed something familiar about the men. A closer look revealed that here were two men who had once been palace guards for his father. One of them was Dumuzi, who had been at the feast where his father was killed. Amon couldn't recall the other fellow's name, but he recognized him as well. Their slovenly appearance and heavy drinking suggested that they had come upon hard times after the ascension of the new king. Giving in to a generous impulse, Amon walked over to their table. The two men looked at him blearily. "Who are you?" the one who wasn't Dumuzi asked drunkenly. "The gods have been unkind to you two," Amon said. "But know that the loyal service you once gave to the king is appreciated." He set 2 silver shekels on the table in front of each of them with a clink. The men stared at the money with an intensity that told him just how desperate things were becoming for them. Amon knew that 2 silver shekels was more money than they could make in a year, assuming that they had even found employment after leaving the palace. "If you choose to take it, here's your chance to change your fates," Amon said. "Enki protect and keep you." As Amon walked out of the tavern, without having drunk anything, he felt the warm glow of a deed well done burning comfortably in his belly. The jittery feeling was gone now, and he knew that his father would approve wholeheartedly of what he had just done. With the jitters gone and his confidence returning, Amon found himself smiling and joking as he hadn't done since the fight with Arya. The wares they had brought for sale this time sold slowly, for Arya hadn't had a chance to give him her usual detailed instructions. But though he felt some anxiety over the slow sales, at length they had disposed of nearly everything, and he and Namhu made their way to the orchard of Etana the olive grower. They were waiting for the servants to finish washing out the jars in preparation for filling them up with olives, when Namhu noticed a group of men coming down the road to Etana's house. "What do you suppose that is?" he asked Amon. "I have no idea," Amon replied. "But it's a simple matter to find out." He approached the group of men and saw that all but one of them were armed. How convenient of you to come and meet us, the unarmed man said to Amon. Then, turning to his men, he said, That's the one, take him. Amon found himself surrounded and grasped by rough hands. What is the meaning of this? Amon demanded. Why are you detaining me? You are the son of a traitor and enemy of the king, the man said. We've been looking for you for a long time. I am Etana of Uruk, an honest olive merchant and brother to the high priestess of Inanna, Amon shouted angrily. How dare you treat me like this? I have powerful friends who will see you suffer if you don't release me at once. Some of the men shifted nervously upon hearing this declaration, and they looked to the unarmed man for confirmation that they should carry on. A ridiculous, transparent lie, the man said. Namhu, Etana, tell this man who I am, Amon called out. Namhu nodded to Etana, and the two of them approached the group of men. This is my business partner, Etana of Uruk, Namhu asserted. He is an honest man, and he is brother to the high priestess of Inanna. The unarmed man seemed less sure of himself now. This man was pointed out to us as the former prince of Eridu by one who knows him well, the man said uncertainly. Where is this man? Amon asked. I demand to confront him. You're in no position to demand anything, the man said, his attitude immediately hardening at Amon's challenge. Come along, we'll sort this out at the palace. Amon began to fear that getting out of this mess was going to require more skill than he could muster himself. He turned back to Namhu. Namhu, in the name of our friendship, I ask you to buy a horse and speed your way as quickly as possible to Uruk. Tell Balashi what has happened, then go to the temple and beg the high priestess to intercede on my behalf, Amon said. I will do as you ask, Namhu promised. Days are spent in a stinking pit, with only what water he could catch when a jarful was poured between the bars, and what barley he could snag when it was thrown to him in the same way, led him on to reflect on his life. It was a life that was going to turn out to be ignominious and short, just as Balashi had predicted. In fact, it seemed that Balashi had been right about everything. Right that Arya had been a spy sent to ferret out his secrets. Right that if he trusted her, he would end up dead. Right that the gods had only set him up with a brief taste of success so they could laugh at him. And even, it seemed, right that Ishtar would make him pay for his mistreatment of Mushazebti. Early on, he had meant to make a suitable offering to Inanna to atone for any guilt associated with violating the woman's hospitality, but he hadn't had the money to do it. Once he'd had the money, he had justified not spending it on an offering because of the good deed he and Balashi had done at the city gates for the farmer and his daughter. Later, Amon decided that it must be Enki who had turned against him. He was, after all, being held in the city of Enki, in the palace of Enki, and within a dozen meters of the underground sacred springs of Enki. There could be no greater indication of the god's displeasure than to hold Amon, who had been the beloved of Enki, in this particular dungeon. Why had Enki deserted him? That was the real question. In thinking over his life, Amon could find nothing in his conduct that would anger the god. He had missed the feast of Enki at the temple, it was true, but he had decided that, since Enki failed to punish many who were far less devoted to the god than he, that could not be the source of the god's ire. Could it be that Enki did not exist at all? In his conversations with Namhu, and occasionally Pusrish Dagon, they had chewed over the notion that the gods were changeable, and that their natures were modified by the men who worshipped them. If that was true, then Amon was in this pit not because he had lost Enki's favor, but because he had never possessed it in the first place. There was no divine being looking out for him and his family. Despair came at him in waves. Doubts about Enki alternated with periods of feverish prayers. At times, he could barely stand to raise his head for the weight of the sorrow and utter dejection that hung on him like bronze, while at others, he felt all but certain that he could feel Enki whispering that he would yet survive this trial if only he didn't lose faith. He spent the interminable hours reviewing his young life in his mind, trying to see if there was sufficient cause for his god to chastise him. Perhaps the poor example he had set for his younger half-brother was to blame for the child's untimely death. He had never fully shaken off the guilt he had felt for that. Perhaps Inanna was punishing him for completely failing to help Iltani. Hadn't she said that Inanna had sent him to her? Yet he had turned out to be utterly impotent in her cause, and he had to admit his enthusiasm to help Iltani had waned in exact proportion to how important Arya had become to him. In his darker moods, he had even considered that perhaps Inanna was punishing him for what he had done to Arya. After all, she had raised a pretty good point. Why had he continued to give useless presents to Iltani? To salve his conscience for failing to do anything else? He sincerely regretted hurting Arya's feelings, though he couldn't feel penitent toward her for more than a few minutes at a time, seeing as how she had betrayed him to his death and all. While in his blackest moods, he had even called out and demanded that they just get on with it. Surely death would be better than being stuck in a pit with only his guilty conscience for company and nothing to think about except his shortcomings. He reasoned that, sooner or later, they were going to find someone they trusted who could positively identify him as the prince, and then they would cut off his head, and that would be the end of him. The only thing keeping him alive now must be the small seed of doubt he had sown when they had taken him. That, and the fact that Lipetenki was away, for he felt sure that the moment the false priest clapped eyes on him, he would order his guards to kill him. Time crawled by in the dark beneath the palace. The only way he had of being sure that it hadn't stopped altogether was the coming and going of the jailer. Unfortunately, even that unreliable method was almost meaningless, for the jailer was not particularly careful in how frequently he fed and watered his charge, and it was only through the infrequent supplies rained down on his head that Amon knew that there was a jailer there at all. He had already grown so parched on 3 different occasions that the temptation to drink from the filthy swill in the bottom of the pit at his feet had been almost overwhelming. In the midst of one of these times of near-complete neglect, inexplicably, the jailer lowered down a pitcher of beer and waited for Amon to drink it before pulling it back up. It was so unexpected that Amon had nearly convinced himself that he'd dreamt it. The thick liquid had revived him more than he would have thought possible, and after that the despair remained at bay for quite some time. However, his respite proved to be short-lived, for the next time the jailer returned, he merely slopped a bit of water and cast a few grains of barley between the bars again. Amon dozed and awakened, and when he slept, his mind was filled with such horrible dreams of captivity and drowning in darkness that it became hard to differentiate when he was awake and when he was asleep. Several different times, he thought that he heard the voice of Enki telling him to trust in the throne of the deep waters. Other times, he could swear that he heard Inanna cursing him and telling him that his line would be cut short. When at last he heard a voice calling his name, he could scarcely credit the reality of it. "My prince, are you in there?" the voice of Balashi whispered. "I'm here," Amon croaked hoarsely. He tried to wet his mouth, but he had no saliva to wet his mouth with. He tried to stand on his feet, but his legs were so badly cramped that they wouldn't hold him, and he toppled over into the filth. "Be still," Balashi warned with a hiss. "We'll have you out in a moment." There was the sound of wood dragging across the floor, and the heavy wooden bars that covered the pit were pulled away. Balashi's strong hand grasped his wrist and pulled him to his feet. Another hand grasped his left arm, and he was lifted easily out of the pit and set gingerly beside it. Amon was surprised to see another dark form beside Balashi. Who had he brought to help him? "Are you well enough to walk?" Balashi asked. "We dare not delay. We've had to kill men to make it this far, and it won't take long for their bodies to be found." He handed a woolen robe to Amon. "Put this on," he said. "Have you any water?" Amon croaked. "If I can get a drink, I think I can make it." "I think I saw a pitcher in the jailer's cell," the other man said. "I'll fetch it." Amon stretched his legs and his back as the man left, and then swiftly returned. The cold liquid running down Amon's throat was such a relief that he wanted to keep drinking and drinking. "Not too much," warned Balashi as he took the pitcher away. "It'll make you feel ill." He helped Amon to his feet, and with the other man beside him, the 3 of them made their way to the stairs out of the dungeon and began climbing. As they passed a torch sconce, Amon recognized the guard Dumuzi that he had found drunk in the tavern when he arrived in Eridu. There was no time to ask how he came to be here, and how Balashi had decided to involve him in the rescue. They had nearly reached the hallway into the palace basement when there was a cry nearby and the shuffling of many feet. Balashi left Amon's side and cautiously peeked around the corner of the wall. "They must have found the first guard," he hissed. "We'll have to fight our way through." "There'll be a dozen guards and more there in a moment," Dumuzi hissed. "We'll never make it." "There is no other choice," Balashi replied as he drew his dagger. Amon's head was fuzzy, but he felt sure there must be an alternative to a brief fight and a quick death. He racked his brain, and at last he had it. "There is another way," he said quickly. "What other way?" Balashi asked. "Between me and Dumuzi, we know all of the secret passages of the palace." "Not all," Amon answered. "Come with me." Leaning on Balashi, Amon led the way back down the stairs. At the wide landing just before the final flight of stairs that led to the dungeons, he began groping along the wall in the corner. "Here," he said to himself, as he found the knot of stone that swung out on a hinge to reveal a catch. "Quickly," Balashi hissed, as Amon stood out of the way to let the stronger men push the heavy door into the passageway. They stepped through the narrow opening, then pushed the stone door back and locked the catch as they heard the slap of feet descending into the dungeon. They groped their way forward in complete darkness down a steeply descending tunnel, wet with condensation. They had gone perhaps 200 paces, when they saw a strange blue light reflecting off the walls. The light grew stronger as they descended, until, at last, they came out into a cave, illuminated with an eerie twilight lit by patches of greenish-blue growing along the walls and ceiling. There was a flat area large enough for the three of them to sit, before the sloping tunnel ended in a deep pool. "Where are we?" Balashi asked, his voice echoing strangely. "At the pool of Enki," Amon replied. "My father brought me here each year on my birthday. He and I partook of the greenish growths you see on the wall, and we drank of the water. Father called it the fruit of life. He told me that whoever eats of this fruit and drinks of the water will have long life far beyond that of normal men." "Is there another way to the surface from here?" Dumuzi asked, with a note of apprehension in his voice. "None that I know of. The pool of Enki goes down and down all the way into the heart of the earth, so perhaps there's an underground river that meets it somewhere, but that's all," Amon replied. "The guards will assume someone helped you to escape, and will search the palace and the grounds," Balashi said. "We'll wait here for a time, perhaps a day or two, then creep out carefully and make our escape." "Stay here? For days?" Dumuzi asked, a note of panic in his voice. "Be calm, Dumuzi," Amon said. "This cave has stood here since the creation of the earth. You are perfectly safe here." Dumuzi didn't seem pacified, but he said nothing more. They sat in silence for a time, until Amon's beating heart calmed and his head felt clearer. "How is it that you came to find me?" he asked Balashi. "And how is it that Dumuzi is here with you?" "There is much to tell," Balashi replied. "And I must set it straight in my mind before I try to tell it. For these past days and nights, I have slept very little, and the strain of it has made my head feel as if it's stuffed with wool so that I can scarcely think." Dumuzi said, "I am not so weary as Balashi, and I will tell you what I know, if Balashi wishes to rest." "Say on," Amon invited. "As you know, you found Ur-Zababa and me in the tavern drinking 22 days ago. You gave us silver shekels and bid us change our fates. I recognized you at once as the rightful prince of Eridu, and, Enki cursed me in the fog of strong drink, I told Ur-Zababa to whom it was we owed our great good fortune. He and I ordered food, and as the effect of the drink wore off, Ur-Zababa began speaking treasonous thoughts. 'What are 2 silver shekels when we might have 10 times that with a single word in the right ear?' he said. I bid the fool to hold his peace, and to thank Enki that the young master saw fit to grant him anything at all, when he had been one of the first to flee like a coward when the palace was attacked. Ur-Zababa held his peace then, but I could see that he had not given up on the idea. Enki, forgive me, I should have slit his throat then and there, for I feared that he would do something rash, but our many years together in the palace dissuaded me, and I did not kill him. However, I was suspicious of Ur-Zababa, and so I followed at a distance when he left the tavern. When he glanced over his shoulder and caught sight of me, he ran as fast as his legs would carry him to the palace. I knew that he would betray you, so I frantically searched all of Eridu wherever I could think to look, asking after a man of your description. I couldn't find you, but after 2 days of looking for you, by chance I came upon Ur-Zababa as he was coming out of a tavern. He didn't deny that he had sold you out, and even went so far as to boast that soon you would be in the underworld with your father. My fury was hot as his treachery, but rather than give him the slow coward's death that he deserved, I killed him quickly and hid his body. For days, I continued my search for you, and at last I was told that you might be found at a certain olive orchard, but I arrived too late and you had already been taken. It took me a lot of searching and much questioning to find anyone who knew anything. But at last, I learned that you were still being held at the palace, after I came across a talkative woman whose cousin works as a servant at the palace. I resolved to do all I could to rescue you before the return of the false priest, whom the woman told me had gone north to swear fealty to the emperor. I began by secretly making my way into the palace and observing the behavior of the guards. Amon nodded. Dumuzi had been one of his father's most trusted bodyguards, and he likely knew even some secret passages that Amon did not, such as the one into the king's chamber. If anyone could make his way unobtrusively through the palace, it was him. The palace was a perpetual beehive. There were guards everywhere, and learning their routines, such as when they go on and off shift and how many are assigned to the critical locations, was difficult. From a few scattered comments I overheard, I concluded that there have already been several attempts on the false king's life, and he retains 3 times as many guards as your father ever had. May Enki guide the feet of the assassins, Amon said. Amen, Dumuzi agreed. He continued. I plan to sneak into the palace at night, descend to the dungeon and rescue you, whatever the hazards. I gathered the supplies I would need. A knife, a rope, an oil lamp, healing herbs in case you had been injured, a robe of your size to disguise you, but one thing eluded me. I would need another strong man to help me lift the heavy log off your prison. It would do me no good to get to you if I couldn't get you out of the pit. It must have been hard to find someone you could trust to help you with such a difficult and dangerous mission, Amon suggested. Dumuzi shook his head. Once, it would have been no problem at all. Any of my friends among the palace guard would have been willing, but I have been a fool since the palace fell to the pretender. I took the death of the king I had sworn to protect very hard. In one night, I had lost everything. My home, my patron, and my livelihood. I looked for comfort in the bottom of a clay jar, and the more I drank, the more I wanted to drink. I borrowed money from my friends until they would lend me no more. Then I bullied some and even sank as low as to steal from one, may Enki forgive me. I was so despicable that none but that worm or Zababa could stand my company. I had been trying to work up the courage for days to end my life, when you set your shekels on the table in front of me, and reminded me of who I had been once. The riddle the gods had given me to solve was how a man with no friends could find the help he needs to do what must be done. I couldn't figure out how I would pull the heavy logs off of the pit that held you without help, but at last I convinced myself that it might be done. I bought a heavy bronze bar with the money I took from Urzababa, and I hoped to use it as a lever to move the log off of the pit myself. I made my way into the tunnel that leads from the palace gardens into the storerooms, and I lay down to sleep to await the deepest night when men are at their least watchful. It was then that Balashi came upon me in the tunnel. We both were startled and would have slain one another, but in his surprise Balashi uttered an oath to Ishtar that I had heard from his lips 1,000 times or more, and I knew at once that he was sent by Enki to aid me. I told Balashi all that I knew, and he agreed that it would be best to carry out my plan. We waited until just after the changing of the guard, and then slipped into the storeroom. Truly, Enki was with me, for I bungled into a guard who had been slow to leave his post, and he would have alerted the entire palace had Balashi not slit the man's throat before he could cry out. We descended to the dungeons and slew the jailer, and the rest you know, for that's when we found and released you. I knew you were brave, and my father always spoke highly of you, Amon told him. But you and I have never traded many words. Yet you have proven to be the most loyal man of all the palace guard save Balashi alone. I will reward you as best I may when we leave this place, but for now, I bid you to partake of the fruit and drink of the water. You have given me many more years of life through your brave actions, and I can think of no better reward than to give you more years of life in return. Are you sure it's safe? Dumuzi asked. Will Enki not punish me for taking the forbidden fruit meant for the beloved family alone? If any man exists who may grant the right to eat the fruit, it is me, the true king of Eridu. I think Enki will agree that your service to me makes you deserving. If you want to wait, however, I will partake tomorrow, and I will offer Balashi the same privilege as I offer to you now, Amon said. I will wait, Dumuzi answered. He slept then, but Amon lay awake for a long time, thinking over all that had occurred. While he was in the pit, he had been certain that his circumstances indicated that a god was displeased with him. Was the miraculous rescue, as related by Dumuzi, a sign of Enki's favor? Or did things just happen, both good and ill, with no direct intervention of the gods at all? It was all more than Amon could figure out. What he did understand, and what brought him more joy than he could imagine, was that Arya was not a spy after all. He had been betrayed by a former palace guard, and Arya had nothing to do with it. When he got back to Uruk, he was going to make her forgive him, whatever it took. Thinking about Arya eventually led him to thoughts of Iltani. What was his relationship to her? What did he want it to be? If he was honest with himself, he still had tender feelings for her, but he didn't feel any longer the mad devotion which, for some reason, had overcome him in the first days after he met her. Thinking on the girls made him impatient to leave, and to do what he could to set things aright in Uruk, whatever it took.